Welcome back to the program. Now, before we went on the break, we focused on the new minimum wage. But you and I know that without revenue, all the talk and negotiations about minimum wage will always end up in a deadlock. But where we stand right now is that the federal government is planning key reforms in the Strategic Revenue Growth Initiative to improve revenue collection. But that's for the 2020 budget. The Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, Mrs. Zainab Ahmed, says the revenue projection stands at 8.15 trillion naira. And that's against the 10.33 trillion naira proposed as expenditure in the budget. Of course, there will be some deficit there. And she was speaking at the budget breakdown and public presentation of the budget in Abuja.
The budget breakdown session gives the federal government an opportunity to give sectoral breakdown of the proposal. But first, how is the government faring with the implementation of the 2019 budget?
Half year 2019, the total expenditure performance was of the 8.92 trillion that was budgeted. Half year will have been 4.58. The actual spend was 3.39, and this represents a 76% performance.
In the 2020 proposal, the government is projecting a revenue generation of 8.15 trillion naira. The breakdown shows that 2.64 trillion naira is coming from crude oil, 1.81 trillion naira from non-oil sector, and 3.7 trillion naira from other sources, including dividends, fines, signature burners, among others.
So those are the figures. But for more perspectives on the federal government's policy thrust on Nigeria's revenue drive within the framework of the 2020 draft budget, the Executive Director of Initiative for Transparency and Accountability, Mr. Bafa Saleh, joins us from our Abuja studio. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon on the program. And now, let's begin from this point.
Thank you for having me.
A lot of people, you're welcome, by the way. A lot of people have called the 2020 budget proposal different names. Well, the federal government has, the terms it uses for it. The opposition party has called it several names, and experts also have waded in. But from where you stand, from the figures you have seen, how would you describe the 2020 budget proposal?
Well, I have not seen much change. I think we're still doing the same thing, and we're expecting different results. When you have the recurrent budget being almost 70% and your capital budget is less than 30%, you don't expect much change. So I don't expect much change in this budget. We wait and see how it performs, but in the last several years, the budget has been poorly implemented.
So when you say you don't expect any change, do you mean in terms of what it will mean for Nigerians, or I'm not entirely sure. How do you mean you don't expect any change?
Yes, for what we see as Nigerians on the street, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of economic power to the masses, I feel that unless we increase our capital expenditure, if we continue with having a high recurrent cost, there won't be much change. So we don't expect much change from this budget.
But the argument sometimes is the fact that some of his figures are inevitable. Talk about debt servicing, for example. Talk about overhead. I mean, all of these things eventually cause the deficit. But I mean, where do we go? We need to, for example, make sure these debts are serviced. We need to pay salaries. So, I mean, what did you expect?
Yes, well, I expected that some other sectors would get more funding, like agriculture. When agriculture is not getting enough funding, you expect that majority of Nigerians are farmers. So the budget for farming is very, very, very low. So you don't expect much growth. For example, take the Kaduna State government's budget. Almost 70% of it is capital. So the federal government has to take a cue from Kaduna State, and that will bring the difference that we're looking for.
While a lot of people would say, a state's budget projections are definitely different from what you have on a federal scale. But let's take a look at the issue of the deficit. Now, we're projecting 10.33 trillion naira total expenditure. And you see that the revenue we're expecting is about 8.15 trillion naira. So that, of course, takes us to that conversation of borrowing. So I'd like to ask you, do you think there might be other creative ways to fund this budget other than borrowing?
Yes, well, I think there's other creative ways to fund the budget, especially when it comes to capital budgeting. And in most countries and developing countries, a lot of infrastructure is being concessionary. So I think the major roads, like the Nigerian government has nothing to do, no business building the second Niger bridge. It should be given to the Chinese or the Americans or anybody to build and toll it. So the same thing as the bridge, what you call the proposed bridge in Lagos. I was reading that the Third Main Bridge, there's almost 170,000 vehicles on a daily basis. If you told that, that means you on 100 naira you'll be making 170 million. So, and I know there are a lot of people, a lot of companies that will be ready to come and invest in that. So I think it's high time that infrastructure is being financed by PPP and being concessioned. Federal government should not be doing capital projects.
Right. So we know that the appropriation bill, as it is now, is at the National Assembly, where the National Assembly will conduct its role of appropriation for the next couple of weeks. But we know that the big picture now is they're saying they're trying to reverse it to the January-December cycle. That leaves us with about, 2 months to achieve that. Do you think we're at the risk of perhaps rushing the budget because we're trying to meet up with this, which, by the way, is commendable?
Well, I feel is a very good development for Nigeria because the budget being implemented on time is very important, and I think the National Assembly are very serious about it. I spoke to some senators and members, and they have been working hard night and day to make sure that they can pass the budget on time. But not only passing the budget, they should equally make sure that the budget is implemented. The problem is that sometimes, even if the budget is passed on time, right, implementation has been the major problem that we have in this country.
Okay.
And it's the work of the National Assembly to make sure that the budget is implemented.
All right.
Unfortunately, most of them are just interested in what they'll be getting from the NDAs, not doing their job. If they were going to do their job, I think we'll be in a better place.
From this point, I'm sure all Nigerians will keep their eyes on the appropriation bill such that we get, a good process out of it eventually. But I'd like to thank you so much, Mr. Bafa Saleh, is Executive Director for Initiative for Transparency and Accountability. Thank you for your thoughts on the program this afternoon.
Thank you for having me again.
Well, let's move over to the southeast, where governors of the region have met in Enugu to prepare ahead of their meeting with President Muhammadu Buhari, where they're expected to discuss the welfare of the southeast. The governors in their last meeting on August the 31st agreed to meet with the president and the service chiefs to discuss and douse security tension in the region, amongst others. Although the chairman of the forum and governor of Ebonyi State, Mr. Dave Umahi, said the outcome of the meeting will be known after they have met with the president, the leaders are expected to discuss the rehabilitation of the Akano Ibiam International Airport, Enugu, which is yet to commence, the state of the roads in the region, and other issues of regional interest. Well, let's move on to other stories. The Nigerian government is reiterating its commitment to cooperate with the International Criminal Court, that's the ICC preliminary examination into issues related to insurgency in the Northeast. And that's to ensure that this process is forthrightly concluded. Nigeria's Vice President, Professor Yemi Osinbajo, gave this assurance at a meeting with the Chief Prosecutor, Mrs. Fatou Bensouda, of the International Criminal Court in Abuja. Well, at the meeting, which was held to discuss Nigeria's support and cooperation with the Office of the Prosecutor at the ICC, the Vice President emphasized that the Nigerian government remained committed to its obligations under the Rome Statute. Well, human rights is a big deal, but that's where we end the program for this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Kaido Kikiolu.